"I'm taking everything," my husband said, his voice calm, almost bored, as if he were discussing the weather instead of dismantling 48 years of our life together. And I remember thinking in that very moment, how strange it was that I felt nothing at all, not anger, not heartbreak, just a quiet stillness settling somewhere deep inside me, the kind that comes when something long expected finally arrives, and I simply looked at him across the breakfast table, at the man I had once believed I would grow old with, and I smiled. The sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, catching the edges of the polished oak table I had wiped down every morning for decades, the same table where we had celebrated birthdays, holidays, quiet Sunday mornings with coffee, and now it sat between us like a line drawn too clearly to ignore. Richard didn't notice the smile, or if he did, he mistook it for weakness, the way he had been mistaking things about me for years. Beside him, her name lingered unspoken but present in everything he did, in the new cologne he had started wearing, in the way he checked his phone with a small private smile, in the late nights at the office that had become routine. Emily Carter, 34. Efficient, polished, always just a little too attentive when she spoke to him at company events, though I had never said a word about it, not because I hadn't seen it, but because I had learned over a lifetime that people reveal themselves fully when they believe no one is watching. "The house, the accounts, the investments," he continued, folding his napkin with deliberate care. "It's all in my name. I've already spoken to my attorney." I nodded once slowly, as if I were absorbing new information, though in truth, there was nothing in his words that surprised me anymore. The man sitting across from me had been slipping away in small, almost invisible ways for the past 2 years, each change subtle enough to ignore on its own, but together forming a pattern that was impossible to miss once you allowed yourself to see it. The early morning meetings that required him to leave before I woke up, the sudden interest in his appearance, the quiet irritation in his voice whenever I asked simple questions about his day. It hadn't happened all at once. It never does. It happens in fragments, in pauses, in the spaces between conversations. And then one day the truth stands fully formed in front of you, asking to be acknowledged. I reached for my coffee, noticing that my hand was steady, steadier than I would have expected, and I took a small sip before setting the cup back down. "And the divorce?" I asked, my voice even measured the way it had been through every challenge I had ever faced. Richard leaned back slightly, as if relieved that we were finally discussing things openly. "Filed this morning," he said. "It's straightforward. At our age, there's no reason to complicate things." At our age. 74 he meant. As if that number somehow justified the quiet erasure of a shared life. As if time made betrayal more acceptable, more reasonable. I let the words settle between us, watching the way he avoided my eyes now, focusing instead on the edge of his plate, and for a brief moment I saw something there, not guilt exactly but discomfort, the kind that comes when someone knows they are crossing a line but has already convinced themselves it's necessary. "And her?" I asked, not because I needed confirmation but because I wanted to hear him say it. Richard hesitated just for a second before answering. "Emily and I are getting married," he said, the words coming out more quickly than before, as if speed could make them less significant. "Married." The word hung in the air, heavy and oddly distant, and I found myself thinking about the first time he had said it to me, decades ago, when everything still felt possible, when we had stood in a small church with borrowed flowers and hopeful hearts, believing that what we were building would last. I studied his face now, searching for traces of the man I had known, but all I saw was someone else entirely, someone who had rewritten our story in his mind until I no longer had a place in it. "I see," I said quietly, and I did see, more clearly than he could possibly understand, because what he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that this moment, the one he believed marked the beginning of his new life, was in fact the end of something else entirely, something he had never taken the time to truly understand. Stood up then, smoothing the front of my blouse, the familiar gesture grounding me as it always had, and I walked to the sink, rinsing my cup with careful precision before placing it on the drying rack. Behind me, I could feel his eyes on my back, waiting perhaps, for a reaction he could recognize, something loud or emotional that would fit the version of me he had constructed. But I gave him nothing. I dried my hands, turned around, and met his gaze with the same calm expression I had worn from the beginning. "You should make sure your attorney has everything in order," I said, my tone almost gentle, and for the first time that morning he looked uncertain, as if something in my response didn't match the outcome he had expected. I held his gaze for a moment longer, just long enough for that uncertainty to take root, before I picked up my purse and walked toward the door. And as I stepped out into the cool morning air, I allowed myself a single quiet thought, one that settled into place with absolute clarity. He believed he was taking everything, but he had no idea what everything really was. 72 hours earlier, the house had felt exactly the way it always had, quiet but full, the kind of quiet that comes from long years of routine rather than absence, and I remember standing at the kitchen counter slicing strawberries for breakfast, the morning light stretching across the granite in soft lines, everything in its place, everything predictable, and yet there had been something just slightly off, something I could not quite name at the time, like a note in a familiar song that no longer sounded right. Richard had already been dressed when I came downstairs, which in itself was not unusual, but he was wearing a shirt I had never seen before, crisp and pale blue, the kind of color he used to say washed him out, and he was adjusting his cufflinks with more care than usual, glancing at his reflection in the window as if he were seeing himself through someone else's eyes. "Early meeting," he had said without looking at me, his voice quick, already halfway out the door, and I had nodded, setting a plate on the table, though he did not sit down to eat. That had been the first moment, though I did not know it then, the first clear sign that something had shifted beyond return. The days that followed carried that same subtle dissonance. Small things that might have meant nothing if they had happened alone but together formed a pattern that pressed quietly against my awareness. He began taking calls outside, stepping onto the back porch even when the weather was cold, his voice low, controlled, and when I asked who it was, he would wave it off with a vague answer about work, about clients, about things that did not concern me. The man who once told me everything, even the smallest details of his day, now chose silence where there had once been openness. And then there was his phone, always within reach, always face down. A small detail that somehow spoke louder than words ever could. I remember one afternoon standing in the doorway of his study, watching him type something quickly before closing his laptop the moment he noticed me. His expression smooth but just a second too late, as if I had caught the edge of something he had not meant to reveal. "Just work," he had said, offering a smile that did not quite reach his eyes, and I had returned it with one of my own, equally measured, equally controlled. It would have been easy to confront him then, to demand answers, to push against the growing distance between us, but something held me back, not fear, not even denial, but a quiet instinct that told me to wait, to observe, to let the truth come to me in its own time. That instinct had served me well over the years in business decisions, in raising our son, in navigating the complexities of a life built over decades, and I trusted it now more than I trusted anything Richard might say. Emily entered the picture in ways that were almost invisible at first, her name mentioned casually in passing. A new assistant who was exceptionally capable, who had brought efficiency to the office, who had made his work easier, smoother, less stressful. He spoke of her often enough that I began to recognize the pattern, the way her name would appear in conversations that did not require it, the way his tone shifted slightly when he mentioned her, lighter, almost energized. I met her once briefly at a company dinner, and she had been exactly as I expected, composed, attentive, her smile perfectly calibrated, her attention focused entirely on Richard in a way that might have seemed respectful to anyone not paying close attention. But I noticed the details, the way she anticipated his needs before he voiced them, the way she laughed just a fraction too quickly at his remarks, the way her presence seemed to draw something out of him that had long been absent in our own home. I did not dislike her, not in the beginning, because dislike would have required me to fully acknowledge what I was beginning to understand, and at that point I was not ready to name it. Instead, I filed the observations away, one by one, building a quiet record of moments that, taken together, told a story neither of them had yet spoken aloud. The final piece came in the form of something small, almost insignificant, a document left on the corner of his desk, partially hidden beneath a folder, the edge of it visible just enough to catch my attention as I passed by. I had not meant to look, or at least that is what I told myself, but my hand moved almost of its own accord, lifting the paper just enough to read the header, and in that instant everything aligned with a clarity that was both shocking and inevitable. It was not the content itself that mattered as much as what it represented, the confirmation of what I had already begun to suspect, the proof that the quiet shifts, the subtle changes, the growing distance had all been leading to this. I replaced the document exactly as I had found it, smoothing the edge carefully, leaving no trace that I had seen it, and I walked out of the room with the same steady steps I had always taken. From that moment on, everything changed, though nothing on the surface appeared different. I continued my routines, prepared meals, maintained the house, spoke to Richard with the same calm tone I had always used. But inside, something had settled into place, a new understanding, a new awareness of the path ahead. I did not need to ask questions anymore. Did not need to confront him or seek explanations, because the answers were already there, clear and undeniable. All that remained was to decide what to do with them. The decision was not made in a single moment but in a series of quiet realizations that followed one another with almost unsettling precision, like dominoes falling in perfect sequence, and by the time I sat down at my desk that afternoon, the house still and silent around me, I already knew that whatever came next would not be driven by emotion but by clarity. I opened the drawer where I kept the documents I had organized over the years, everything labeled, everything in order, a habit I had developed long before I understood how valuable it would become, and I began to review them one by one, not searching for anything specific at first but allowing the structure of my own careful planning to guide me. Marriage certificates, property deeds, account statements, investment summaries, each page a record of decisions made together, or at least decisions I had believed were made together. And as I moved through them, I began to notice something that Richard had clearly overlooked. There were signatures he did not question, accounts he did not fully understand, arrangements made years ago when we both assumed we were building something permanent, something shared, but in reality, those arrangements had quietly placed certain things under my control in ways that had never needed to be discussed. I paused over one particular document, the ink slightly faded but still clear, the language precise, and I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible exhale. It was all still there, exactly as it had been set, untouched, unchallenged. He had assumed ownership because he had always assumed understanding, and those are not the same thing. I closed the folder gently and leaned back in my chair, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the distant sound of a car passing on the street outside. Ordinary sounds that grounded me in a reality that was shifting in ways Richard had not anticipated. That evening when he returned home, everything appeared exactly as it always had. I greeted him at the door, asked about his day, prepared dinner with the same care I had shown for decades, and he responded in kind, or at least in the version of kind he had been offering recently, distracted, polite, distant. If he noticed anything different about me, he did not show it, and I realized then how little attention he had truly been paying, how much he had come to rely on the assumption that I would remain exactly as I had always been, predictable, accommodating, unaware. It was a useful assumption for both of us, though not in the way he intended. Over the next 2 days, I moved through my routines with a deliberate calm, making small adjustments that would have seemed insignificant to anyone watching but were, in fact, part of a larger pattern. I made a phone call to an attorney whose name I had not spoken in years, scheduling a meeting under the simple pretense of reviewing estate documents, a task that would raise no suspicion and required no explanation. I visited the bank, not to withdraw or deposit, but to confirm details, to ask questions in a tone that suggested routine rather than urgency, and I listened carefully to the answers, noting what had changed and what had not. Information I had learned is rarely hidden outright. It is simply overlooked by those who believe they already know enough. Each interaction added another piece to the picture, reinforcing what I had begun to understand that afternoon at my desk. Richard had made plans, certainly, and those plans were bold in their confidence, but they were built on incomplete knowledge, on assumptions that had never been tested because there had never been a reason to test them. Until now. On the third day, I met with the attorney in a quiet office that overlooked a row of trees just beginning to turn with the early signs of fall, their leaves shifting from green to gold. A reminder that change does not happen all at once but reveals itself gradually, in stages that are easy to miss until the transformation is complete. He listened as I outlined the situation in measured terms, providing only what was necessary, and when he reviewed the documents I had brought, his expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a subtle acknowledgement of something he had not expected to see. "This is very thorough," he said finally, and I nodded, not because I needed his validation, but because it confirmed what I already knew. When I left his office, the air felt cooler, sharper, and I took a moment to stand on the sidewalk, watching the leaves move gently in the breeze, considering the path ahead. There would be a moment, I understood, when everything would come to the surface, when Richard would present his version of the truth with confidence and certainty, and I would have to respond. But that moment had not yet arrived, and until it did, there was no reason to disrupt the illusion he had so carefully constructed. So I returned home, placed my keys on the same table where they always rested, and resumed the life he believed was still unchanged, all the while knowing that the outcome he expected was already slipping quietly out of his reach. The house began to feel different after that, not because anything had visibly changed but because I was no longer moving through it with the same assumptions, and once you stop assuming you start noticing things that were always there, waiting quietly to be seen. Richard's routines became easier to read, almost predictable in their precision, the exact times he would check his phone, the subtle shift in his tone when a message appeared, the way he positioned himself slightly away from me when he responded, as if distance alone could conceal intention. It was not carelessness on his part, not entirely, but confidence, the kind that grows when someone believes they have already secured the outcome they want. That confidence was, in its own way, revealing. One evening, as I set the table for dinner, I watched him through the reflection in the glass cabinet, his face lit faintly by the glow of his screen, a small smile forming and disappearing before he realized I was nearby. He did not look up when I called his name, not immediately, and that delay, that fraction of a second, told me more than any explanation ever could. "Dinner is ready," I said, my voice steady, unchanged, and he responded with a distracted acknowledgement, placing his phone face down on the table as he joined me, a gesture that might have seemed considerate to anyone not paying attention. But I was paying attention now. The conversation that followed was familiar in its structure and empty in its substance. Small observations about the day, neutral topics that required no depth, no engagement, and I allowed it to unfold without interruption, offering responses that matched his tone, neither encouraging nor resisting, simply present. It was in these moments, in the quiet spaces between words, that the full shape of our new reality became clear. We were no longer sharing a life. We were maintaining a performance. And the more he believed in that performance, the easier it became for me to see beyond it. The next morning I found another detail, smaller than the others but no less significant, a receipt tucked into the pocket of his jacket as I prepared it for cleaning, the paper slightly crumpled, the ink fresh enough to read without effort. It was from a boutique hotel downtown, a place I recognized not because we had ever stayed there together but because I had passed it often enough to know it catered to discretion more than convenience. I held the receipt for a moment, feeling the texture of the paper between my fingers, considering what it represented, not just the action itself but the assumption behind it, the belief that such things would go unnoticed, unexamined, unchallenged. I returned it to the pocket exactly as I had found it, smoothing the fabric with the same care I applied to everything else in this house, and I continued with my day. There was no need to confront him, no need to ask questions whose answers were already clear. Confrontation, I understood now, would serve only one purpose, to alert him that the balance had shifted, that I was no longer the version of myself he believed me to be. And that was not something I was prepared to reveal, not yet. Instead, I allowed him to continue to move forward with his plans, to build his confidence in the outcome he expected, because the more certain he became, the less careful he would be. And carelessness in situations like this is often the most honest form of truth. In the days that followed, I began to notice how thoroughly Emily had woven herself into the structure of his life, not just in the obvious ways but in the subtle ones, the changes in his schedule that aligned perfectly with hers, the new preferences that mirrored what I had observed about her at that dinner, the gradual replacement of habits we had built together with ones that seemed to originate elsewhere. It was not sudden. It was methodical. And it had been happening for far longer than I had allowed myself to acknowledge. I moved through the house that afternoon, pausing in rooms that held the weight of years, the living room where we had hosted friends, the study where decisions had been made, the bedroom where we had once spoken easily about everything that mattered, and I saw them differently now, not as spaces defined by what they had been but as evidence of what had changed. Nothing had been taken from me yet, not physically, not in the way Richard believed, but something more important had already shifted. The understanding of who we were, of what we had built, of what he believed he was entitled to claim as his alone. That understanding was no longer shared. By the time evening settled in, bringing with it the familiar rhythm of another dinner, another quiet exchange, I had reached a clarity that felt both steady and irreversible. I would not interrupt him. I would not challenge him. I would not give him the opportunity to adjust his plans in response to mine. Instead, I would do what I had always done best. I would observe, I would prepare, and when the moment came, I would act with the same calm certainty he had mistaken for weakness. And this time that mistake would matter. The shift from observation to action did not announce itself with urgency or noise but settled into place with the same quiet certainty that had guided me through every important decision in my life. And by the time the next morning arrived, I no longer felt like someone reacting to a situation but like someone stepping into a role I had been preparing for without fully realizing it. I woke before Richard, as I often did, and moved through the kitchen with practiced ease, the familiar rhythm of making coffee, arranging the table, creating a scene so unchanged that it would give him no reason to question anything. There is a certain power and consistency in allowing someone to believe that nothing has shifted, and I used that power deliberately now. When he came downstairs, his expression was relaxed, almost satisfied, as if the weight of whatever decision he had already made had been lifted simply by committing to it, and I greeted him with the same calm warmth I had always shown, offering him his cup of coffee exactly the way he liked it, watching as he accepted it without hesitation, without suspicion. He believed he was in control. That belief was essential. Over breakfast, he spoke more freely than he had in weeks, mentioning future plans in vague terms, referencing changes that would come soon, and I listened without interruption, nodding at the appropriate moments, allowing him to fill the space with his own confidence. It is remarkable how much people will reveal when they are not challenged, when they feel secure in their assumptions, and by the time he left the house that morning, I understood not only what he intended to do but how certain he was that it would unfold exactly as he expected. That certainty was not something I needed to disrupt. It was something I could use. After he left, I cleared the table slowly, rinsing each dish with careful attention, not because the task required it but because the act itself grounded me, gave my thoughts the space to settle into order. Once everything was in place, I went to the study and closed the door behind me, the soft click of the latch marking a quiet transition from the life I had been maintaining to the one I was now actively shaping. I gathered the documents I had reviewed before, adding a few more I had identified in the days since, organizing them into a structure that made sense not just to me but to anyone who would need to understand the full scope of what they represented. Ownership, authority, control, these were not abstract concepts, not in this context, but tangible realities defined by signatures, dates, and carefully constructed agreements that had been put in place long before Richard began to imagine he could claim them as his own. I placed the folder into my bag and checked the time, noting that I had exactly enough to do what needed to be done without drawing attention to any change in my routine. The bank was my first stop, a familiar building where I had been recognized for years not just as Richard's wife, but as an individual with her own standing, her own history of decisions and responsibilities. The teller greeted me by name, her smile warm and unguarded, and I returned it with equal ease, requesting access to information in a tone that suggested continuity rather than urgency. Questions asked calmly tend to receive clearer answers, and I listened carefully as each detail was confirmed, each piece of the structure I had reviewed aligning exactly as I had expected. Nothing had been altered. Nothing had been transferred. Everything remained precisely where it had been placed, secured in ways that did not require Richard's awareness to remain valid. From there, I went to the attorney's office, not for a formal meeting this time but to leave copies of the documents, ensuring that everything was recorded, acknowledged, and ready to be presented when the moment required it. Preparation, I had learned, is not about reacting quickly but about ensuring that when the time comes, there is no need to react at all. By the time I returned home, the afternoon light had shifted, casting longer shadows across the floor, and the house felt exactly as it always had, unchanged on the surface, quietly evolving beneath it. Richard would come home later, carrying with him the same assumptions, the same confidence, and I would meet him with the same calm presence he had come to expect, offering nothing that would disrupt the version of reality he believed he was controlling. But now there was a difference, one he could not see, one he would not understand until it was too late to adjust. I was no longer waiting for the truth to reveal itself. I had already seen it, already understood it, and more importantly, I had already prepared for what would happen when he finally decided to act. And when that moment arrived, it would not be a surprise to me. It would be the confirmation of something I had quietly put into motion long before he realized there was anything to question. The days that followed unfolded with a precision that felt almost rehearsed, as if both of us were moving toward the same moment from opposite directions, each convinced of our own understanding of what would happen when we finally arrived there. And it was in that quiet convergence that I found a kind of clarity I had not expected to feel. Richard grew more assured with each passing day, his movements lighter, his tone more decisive, as though he had already stepped into the life he was planning to claim, and I observed it all with the same calm attention I had maintained from the beginning, noting the details not because I needed confirmation but because they reinforced the pattern I had already recognized. He began taking longer calls in the evenings, no longer stepping outside but remaining in the living room, his voice low but no longer cautious, as if the need for discretion had diminished now that he believed the outcome was inevitable. I would sit nearby, a book open in my hands, turning pages at a steady pace, allowing him to assume my attention was elsewhere, while in truth I was listening not to his words but to the confidence behind them, the subtle shift from hesitation to certainty that revealed more than anything he might have said directly. There is a moment in situations like this when a person crosses from planning into expectation, when they no longer consider the possibility of resistance because they have convinced themselves there will be none, and Richard had reached that moment without realizing it. It showed in the way he spoke about the future now, not in direct statements but in casual references, in the assumption that certain changes were already decided, already in motion, already beyond question. One evening, as we sat across from each other at the dining table, he mentioned selling the house in a tone that suggested it was simply the next logical step, not a decision to be discussed but an outcome to be accepted, and I responded with a slight nod, a neutral acknowledgement that gave him exactly what he expected and nothing more. Inside, however, I noted the detail carefully, adding it to the structure I had already built, understanding how it would fit into what was coming next. The following morning, I received a call from the attorney, his voice measured but carrying a note of quiet confirmation as he reviewed the documents I had provided, outlining the implications with a clarity that left no room for interpretation. Everything was exactly as I had believed it to be. The arrangements made years ago remained intact, the ownership structures unchanged, the authority defined in ways that did not align with the assumptions Richard was now relying on. I thanked him, ended the call, and set the phone down gently on the table, allowing the weight of that confirmation to settle fully before I moved on. There was no urgency, no need to act immediately, because the timing, I understood, would be just as important as the facts themselves. That afternoon I took a walk through the neighborhood, something I had done countless times before, following the same path past the same houses, the same trees, the same familiar landmarks, and yet everything felt slightly different. Not because the surroundings had changed but because my perspective had shifted. I was no longer moving through a life defined by shared expectations. I was moving toward a moment of transition that would redefine everything that came after. When I returned home, Richard was already there, sitting in the living room with a folder open on his lap, papers neatly arranged, his posture straight, composed, prepared. He looked up as I entered, his expression carrying a trace of something new, something closer to anticipation than anything I had seen before. "We need to talk," he said, his voice steady, controlled, and I recognized the tone immediately, the same tone he had used in business meetings when presenting a decision he believed was final. I set my bag down, removed my coat, and took a seat across from him, folding my hands in my lap with the same calm composure I had maintained throughout this entire process. "Of course," I replied, meeting his gaze without hesitation, and in that moment I saw it clearly, the certainty in his eyes, the belief that he was about to take control of the situation in a way that would leave no room for negotiation. He opened the folder, sliding a set of documents across the table toward me, his movements deliberate, confident, and I glanced down at them briefly before looking back up, allowing a small, almost imperceptible smile to form, not of defiance, not of challenge, but of understanding. He believed this was the moment everything would shift in his favor. He had no idea that the shift had already happened, quietly, completely, long before he ever placed those papers in front of me. He waited for me to react, that much was clear, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table as if bracing for something emotional, something unpredictable, but when I did not move, when I simply let my gaze rest on the documents without reaching for them, a subtle tension entered his posture, almost imperceptible but unmistakable once you knew where to look. "You should read them," he said after a moment, his voice still controlled but carrying a slight edge, the first hint that this was not unfolding exactly as he had imagined. I nodded slowly then, reached forward and lifted the top page, scanning it with a calm, measured attention, Not because I needed to understand what it contained, but because the act itself served a purpose, allowing him to believe that I was processing something new, something that required consideration. The language was exactly what I expected, structured to present his position as both reasonable and final, outlining the division of assets in a way that assumed his authority without question, his entitlement stated in terms that left little room for interpretation if one accepted the premise behind them. I turned the page, then another, maintaining the same steady rhythm, aware of his eyes on me, watching for any sign of hesitation, any indication that I might resist. But there was none. When I finished, I placed the papers back on the table and folded my hands once more, meeting his gaze with the same quiet composure I had shown from the beginning. "You have been very thorough," I said, my tone even, almost reflective, and for a brief moment, something like satisfaction flickered across his expression, as if he had just received confirmation that everything was proceeding according to plan. "I wanted to make this as simple as possible," he replied, leaning back slightly, the confidence returning to his posture. "At our stage in life, there is no reason to complicate things. Simple." The word settled between us, carrying a weight he did not seem to recognize. I allowed a small pause before speaking again, just long enough to let that confidence settle fully into place. "And you are certain," I said quietly, "that everything is accounted for?" He frowned slightly, not in doubt but in mild irritation, as if the question itself was unnecessary. "Of course," he said, his tone sharpening just enough to reveal the assumption behind it. "I have reviewed everything with my attorney. There are no surprises here." "No surprises." I inclined my head, acknowledging his certainty without challenging it, and reached for my bag, opening it with the same unhurried precision I had used for every action up to this point. Inside, the folder rested exactly where I had placed it, the documents within arranged in an order that mirrored his, though the content told a very different story. I removed it and set it gently on the table, sliding it toward him with a movement so controlled it almost felt like part of the same conversation he believed he was leading. "Then perhaps," I said, my voice calm, almost conversational, "you will not mind reviewing these as well." He hesitated just for a second, his eyes dropping to the folder before returning to my face, searching for something, perhaps an explanation, perhaps a sign that this was not what it appeared to be. But I offered him nothing beyond the same steady gaze. Slowly, he reached forward and opened the folder, his movement still confident but now tempered with a trace of caution that had not been there before. I watched as he read, noting the exact moment his expression changed, the slight tightening around his eyes, the shift in his posture as the assumptions he had been relying on began to unravel, not dramatically, not all at once, but with the quiet inevitability of something that had always been there, waiting to be seen. He turned a page, then another, his movements less controlled now, more deliberate, as if searching for something that would restore the certainty he had just lost. "What is this?" he asked finally, his voice no longer as steady as it had been, though he was clearly trying to maintain it. I tilted my head slightly, considering the question, though the answer was already clear. "It is what we agreed to," I said, my tone unchanged, "years ago when we structured everything together." His gaze snapped up to meet mine, the confidence that had filled it earlier now replaced by something else, something closer to disbelief. "That is not possible," he said, almost immediately, as if the statement itself could undo what he had just read. I did not respond right away, allowing the silence to stretch between us, giving him the space to process what he was seeing without interference. This was not a moment that required explanation. It required recognition. He looked back down at the documents, flipping through them again, more quickly now, as if speed might change their meaning, as if repetition might reveal an error that was not there. But the structure remained the same, clear, precise, unambiguous. When he finally looked up again, the certainty was gone entirely, replaced by a question he could not yet form into words. And in that moment I understood something with absolute clarity. This was the point where his version of reality ended and mine began. For a moment he said nothing, and in that silence I could see the exact point where certainty had given way to something far less stable, something unsettled and unfamiliar. And it was not anger that appeared first but confusion, the kind that comes when a person realizes that the foundation they have been standing on is not what they believed it to be. He looked back down at the documents again, slower this time, his eyes moving carefully across each line as if the meaning might shift if he examined it closely enough. But it did not shift, it did not bend, it remained exactly as it had always been, clear and fixed and entirely outside the version of events he had constructed in his mind. "This does not make sense," he said finally, his voice lower now, less controlled, as though he were speaking more to himself than to me, and I watched him without interruption, allowing him to work through the realization in his own time. There is a certain dignity in silence when the truth is already present, when explanation would only diminish what is being understood, and I chose to preserve that silence rather than fill it. He turned another page, then went back, retracing his steps, his fingers pressing slightly harder against the paper as if the physical act of holding it might ground him in something more certain. "These accounts," he said, pausing, his brow tightening. "They are not structured the way I was told." I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging the statement without confirming or denying it, because the answer was already in front of him. He simply needed to accept it. "And the house," he continued, his voice rising just enough to reveal the strain beneath it. "This says it is not solely in my name." I let a small breath pass before responding, not as a correction but as a clarification. "It was never solely in your name," I said, my tone even, almost gentle, and the simplicity of the statement seemed to unsettle him more than any confrontation would have. He looked up sharply, searching my face again, but there was nothing there for him to challenge, nothing defensive, nothing reactive, only the same calm presence that had been there from the beginning. "We arranged it together," I continued, "years ago when we made sure that everything we built would be protected, regardless of what happened later." The words settled between us, not as an argument but as a fact, one that required no elaboration because it had already been documented, already been agreed upon, already been set into place long before this moment ever arrived. He leaned back in his chair slowly, the movement no longer confident but measured, as if he were recalibrating his understanding of the situation in real time. "My attorney reviewed all of this," he said, though now the statement sounded less like certainty and more like an attempt to recover it. He confirmed that everything was in order. I allowed a brief pause before responding, just long enough for him to recognize the weight of what I was about to say. "He reviewed what you provided," I said quietly, "not what exists in full." The distinction was subtle but significant, and I watched as it registered, as the implications began to take shape behind his eyes. He looked back down at the folder once more, flipping through the pages with less precision now, his movements betraying the growing realization that the narrative he had relied on was incomplete, that the authority he believed he held was not as absolute as he had assumed. "This changes things," he said finally, the words coming out slowly, as if he were testing them for accuracy, and I met his gaze with the same steady composure. "It clarifies things," I replied, and the difference between those two perspectives hung quietly in the space between us. He opened his mouth as if to respond, then stopped, the words failing to form, and for the first time since this began, I saw not confidence, not control, but uncertainty, genuine and unguarded. It was not a dramatic shift, not an obvious collapse, but a subtle realignment, the kind that happens internally before it ever becomes visible externally. He had expected resistance, perhaps emotion, perhaps even conflict, but he had not expected this calm presentation of a reality he could not immediately challenge, this quiet dismantling of the assumptions he had built his plans upon. I did not press the advantage, did not push further because there was no need to. The information was already there, the implications already unfolding, and anything more would have been unnecessary. Instead, I simply sat there, composed, present, allowing him the space to absorb what he was now beginning to understand. This was no longer a conversation he controlled. It was a situation he had entered without fully understanding the terms. And as that realization settled in, I knew that whatever came next would not be determined by what he had intended, but by what had always been true, waiting quietly beneath the surface until the moment it could no longer be ignored. He did not speak immediately after that, and in the quiet that followed, I could feel the entire weight of what had just shifted settling into place, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the same steady inevitability that had carried this moment from the beginning, and I realized then that there was nothing left to explain, nothing left to prove, only the simple act of allowing the truth to remain where it was, fully visible and impossible to ignore. Richard sat there, the folder still open in front of him, his fingers resting against the pages without turning them, as if he had reached the limit of what he could process in that moment, and for the first time in many years, he looked at me not with assumption, not with quiet dismissal, but with something closer to recognition, though even that seemed incomplete, as if he were only beginning to understand what he had overlooked for so long. "So what happens now?" he asked finally, his voice lower than before, stripped of the certainty that had defined it just hours earlier, and I considered the question carefully, not because I needed to decide but because the answer deserved to be given with the same clarity that had guided everything up to this point. I rose from my chair slowly, smoothing the fabric of my blouse with a familiar, grounding motion, and walked to the window, looking out at the street where nothing had changed, where the world continued exactly as it always had, indifferent to the quiet unraveling of what we had once called a life together. "Now," I said, turning back to face him, "we proceed with the truth." The words were simple, but they carried a finality that did not need to be emphasized. He frowned slightly, as if searching for a more complicated answer, something that might allow him to regain control of the situation, but there was none to offer. The complexity had already been resolved. What remained was straightforward. "The documents you brought," I continued, gesturing lightly toward the papers he had presented earlier, "can be reviewed properly with all relevant information included, and decisions can be made based on what actually exists, not on what was assumed." He listened without interrupting, though I could see the effort it took, the adjustment required to accept a position that was no longer defined by his expectations. "And the house," he said after a moment, his tone cautious now, almost tentative, "what happens to it?" I met his gaze steadily, offering him the same level of honesty I had maintained throughout. "The house remains where it has always been," I said, "under the structure we agreed upon, protected in the way we intended." There was no need to elaborate further. He understood. Perhaps not every detail, not every implication, but enough to recognize that the outcome he had envisioned was no longer possible, at least not in the form he had imagined. He looked down again, then back up, and I saw something shift in his expression, not acceptance, not yet, but the beginning of it, the slow realization that control had never been as complete as he believed. "And you?" he said quietly. "What do you want?" It was an interesting question, one that might have carried more weight if it had been asked earlier, before assumptions had replaced conversation, before decisions had been made without consideration. I allowed myself a brief pause, not out of hesitation but out of respect for the significance of the answer. "I want clarity," I said finally, "and I have it." The simplicity of that statement seemed to settle something between us, not resolving the situation but defining it in terms that left little room for confusion. I picked up my bag from the table, the same one I had carried through each step of this process, and moved toward the door, not hurried, not hesitant, simply continuing forward in the same measured way I had moved from the beginning. Behind me, I could hear the faint rustle of paper as he adjusted the documents, perhaps reviewing them again, perhaps searching for something that would restore the version of reality he had lost, but I did not turn back. There was nothing behind me that required my attention anymore. At the door I paused briefly, my hand resting on the handle, and for a moment I allowed myself to acknowledge the full scope of what had changed, not just in the room behind me but within myself, the shift from someone who had been part of a shared narrative to someone who now stood entirely on her own understanding. It was not a loss. It was a transition. I opened the door and stepped outside, the air cool and steady against my skin, and as I walked down the path, I felt no need to look back, no need to confirm what I already knew. He had believed he was taking everything, that he could redefine the terms of our life without consequence, but in the end, all he had done was reveal how little he had ever truly understood. And as I reached the end of the driveway and continued forward, I carried with me not what had been taken, but what had always been mine, quietly, completely, and without question.